Do you really think we should do this? Priscilla's voice was a fragile whisper, her eyes searching Brian's face for reassurance. Brian nodded, but the motion was hesitant and uncertain. It's just like what we saw in the video, he said, his voice barely audible, his word laced with hesitation, as if speaking them out loud might make his fear undeniable. Let's just make it quick, Priscilla murmured, as she quickly pulled off her clothes, urging Brian to pull his own faster. She was ready to do what they had learned from watching the videos in Brian's phone. She just couldn't wait for him to slide into her. In the heart of the vibrant city of Calabar, within the serenity of a quiet compound, two families, the Gregorys and the Robinsons, stood as the epitome of neighborly harmony, their connection blossoming into a bond that felt more like family than mere friendship. Brian, the vibrant son of Mrs. Janet, and Priscilla, the cheerful daughter of Mrs. Rosaline, both 13 years old, shared a bond that was as natural as the sunrise. From attending school together to filling the compound with their playful laughter, they were a delightful pair, always on some spirited adventure. Brian, the beloved and treasured only child of Mr. George and Mrs. Janet, was the apple of their eye. He was the heartbeat of their home. Determined to keep him happy always and make learning more exciting for him, Mr. George gifted him a sleek smartphone, a gesture that combined both love and encouragement for his growth. At first, Brian's use of the phone was pure and playful, immersed in vibrant games and cartoon marathons on YouTube, his curiosity as boundless as his joy. Priscilla was always there, her laughter echoing beside him as they discovered the hidden wonders of the phone together. The phone became their shared treasure, a portal to endless laughter and adventure that transformed quiet afternoons into moments of magic. One unusually quiet evening, with the compound cloaked in stillness and their mothers away at the market, Brian decided to share a new discovery with Priscilla. As he scrolled through the phone, his fingers paused on an app brimming with countless videos, one he rarely explored, but today curiosity whispered, urging him to delve deeper, and he couldn't resist its call. Brian's finger lingered over a thumbnail bursting with bold colors and intense expressions, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What's that, Brian?" Priscilla whispered, leaning in closer. "I don't know, Priscilla," he replied with a mischievous grin. "Let's find out." With a shared glance of excitement, the two slipped into Brian's room, quietly locking the door behind them. They settled cross-legged on his bed, the phone resting between them like a secret waiting to be uncovered. As the video began, they were met with strange, enigmatic scenes. The characters on the screen moved in ways they didn't quite understand, their low, dramatic voices weaving an unfamiliar yet oddly captivating narrative. Priscilla's eyes widened. "What are they doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Brian shrugged, his gaze fixed on the screen. "I don't know," and yet their fascination only deepened, pulling them in further, drawing them deeper into the mystery. They watched in silence, unable to look away from the unfolding mystery happening on the screen before them. There was something undeniably exciting about it, a sense of adventure in the unknown, even though they couldn't fully understand what they were seeing. They exchanged a curious, silent look, their bond stronger in the shared mystery as they watched the strange scenes unfold before them. The sudden creak of the compound gate swinging open broke their trance, sending a wave of panic through them. They froze, realizing their mothers could be returning at any moment. They exchanged wide-eyed glances. Could their mothers be home already? Brian's hands shook as he fumbled with the phone, desperate to close the video. But in his rush, he accidentally cranked up the volume. Priscilla gasped. "Turn it off, they'll hear us." "I'm trying," Brian whispered urgently, his heart racing in his chest. The sound of footsteps echoed through the compound, sending a jolt of panic through the children. They froze, holding their breath, as the voices of their mothers grew louder, drawing closer to the apartment. Desperation seized Brian. With trembling hands, he managed to close the app and quickly stuffed the phone under his pillow, just as the door handle rattled. "Brian, open the door!" Mrs. Janet's voice called out from the other side. In an instant, the children shared a silent look and, without a word, seamlessly slipped into a game of hide-and-seek, pretending they had been playing all along. Janet didn't suspect a thing, her familiarity with Priscilla's frequent visits to their house making their behavior seem completely normal to her. By the afternoon of the following day, Brian and Priscilla returned back from school, their uniforms slightly rumpled from the fun and chaos of the day at school. As they entered the compound, the quietness struck them immediately. Both their parents were out again. Their hearts raced with a rush of excitement, and nervousness flooded their hearts, knowing that another opportunity had arrived. Brian rushed into his room, tossing his school bag onto the bed in a blur of movement. He quickly changed into a comfy t-shirt and shorts, eager for what was to come. Meanwhile, Priscilla, in her room, swiftly pulled on a casual dress, then tiptoed toward Brian's door, her footsteps light with excitement. She knocked gently, and Brian opened the door, a smile instantly spreading across his face as he saw her. "Priscilla, I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice hushed yet full of excitement. "Let's finish the movie from yesterday," she replied, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Brian nodded, locking the door behind her. Together they climbed onto the bed, the phone resting between them, ready to continue their secret adventure. Brian scrolled through the apps until he found the video, the screen glowing with the paused image from the day before. Instantly, their curiosity reignited, pulling them back into its mysterious allure. "Promise me this stays between us," Brian whispered, his voice barely audible as he glanced at Priscilla. "Of course, just you and me," she replied with a quick nod, her voice soft but resolute. With a deep breath, Brian tapped play, and the video resumed. The strange and unfamiliar scenes began to play out before them, like a secret they weren't meant to see, drawing them deeper into their private world. Though the meaning of what they watched remained unclear, the allure of its forbidden nature was undeniable. It became their private refuge, a hidden world brimming with mystery, waiting for them in the silent hours when the compound was still and their parents were gone. In the months that followed, their hidden routine unfolded like clockwork. As soon as their parents left the house, Priscilla would quietly slip into Brian's room. The door would click shut, locking the world outside, and together they'd settle on the bed, side by side, their eyes fixed on the glowing screen that held their shared intrigue. Each new video seemed more interesting than the previous one. It went further into its strange, enigmatic world, more puzzling and captivating than the one before. At first, they still filled the compound with their laughter and playful energy, but slowly, an invisible change began to settle over them, altering the way they spent their time. As time passed, they grew quieter, more withdrawn. The lively games and bursts of laughter that once filled the compound gradually faded into a heavy silence. Their parents noticed the change but simply attributed it to the natural course of growing up. One evening, Mrs. Janet found Brian sitting alone on the living room couch, his silence more apparent than ever. She approached him, concerned in her eye. "Brian, is everything okay? You've been so quiet lately," she asked, her brow furrowed in worry. "I'm fine, Mama," Brian replied, his gaze avoiding hers, the weight of his unspoken thoughts hanging in the air. In Mrs. Rossellini's apartment, Priscilla had become equally withdrawn. When her mother Roselline asked why she wasn't playing outside, Priscilla would only shrug and reply, "I don't feel like it, Mom." Though the bond between Priscilla and Brian remained, but something had shifted. It was obviously no longer the same. Their carefree and playful days of running through the compound were gradually fading away. Now their bond was built on quiet, stolen glances and whispered secrets about the hidden world they shared, a world that felt far away from their childhood innocence, which no one else outside the two of them knew. One evening, as the glow of the screen illuminated their faces, Priscilla hesitated before turning to Brian. "Do you think it's wrong for us to watch these?" she asked softly, uncertainty lacing her voice. Brian paused the video, his gaze shifting to her. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "It's just interesting, isn't it?" Priscilla nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered in her eyes. "Maybe," she murmured, her tone betraying a hint of unease. "What if someone finds out?" Priscilla whispered, her voice trembling with unease. "They won't," Brian replied firmly, his tone resolute. It's our secret." Yet the burden of that secret was beginning to take its toll. Both children grew increasingly withdrawn, their moods shifting like unsettled tides. Priscilla would sometimes break down in tears without reason, while Brian became irritable and defensive at the slightest question. Unknowingly, they had ventured further into the shadowy depths of the unknown, a place that was quietly changing them in ways they didn't yet understand. As time passed, their curiosity drove them to uncover new apps and websites filled with content similar to what they had been watching. It felt like stumbling upon a hidden treasure trove, carefully tucked away from the watchful eyes of adults. The videos became bolder, the scenes more perplexing and provocative. They didn't fully comprehend what they were watching, but it captivated them all the same. When they weren't glued to the screen, their whispered conversations revolved around the strange and forbidden world they had begun to explore. "What do you think those things mean?" Priscilla asked one day, her voice laced with curiosity as she studied Brian's expression. Brian shrugged, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know, it's strange." Priscilla leaned in, a spark of mischief and curiosity lighting up her face. "But if we tried it, like they're doing, maybe then we'll understand." Brian's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock as her words hung in the air, unsettling and impossible to ignore. The thought sent a ripple of unease through Brian. "What if it's dangerous? What if Mommy catches us?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. Priscilla shook her head, her tone steady and reassuring. "No one will know. It'll just be us." Brian hesitated, his heart racing. He wanted to refuse, to tell her it was a terrible idea, but the fear of disappointing her kept the words trapped inside. "Okay," he finally agreed, his voice trembling with doubt. The opportunity to try what they had been watching for a long time came on a calm afternoon, with both their mothers out at the market, leaving the house empty and quiet. The compound was peaceful, broken only by the soft chirping of birds in the distance. Priscilla knocked gently on Brian's door, and he opened it hesitantly. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Priscilla nodded with quiet confidence, her eyes locking with his. "It's just us, remember?" she said, as if that was all that mattered. They chose the bathroom, believing it would be the safest spot to avoid arousing any suspicion. If anyone returned unexpectedly, they could easily pretend to be bathing together. Once inside, Brian retrieved his phone, his fingers shaking ever so slightly. He had bookmarked a specific video earlier, a style he thought they should try. With a deep breath, he opened the video and held the phone up for Priscilla to see. "Let's start with this," he whispered, his voice barely audible, the tension in the air thickening. Priscilla nodded, her eyes locked on the screen, a quiet, "okay," escaping her lips as the world around them seemed to fade away. "What do we do first?" Priscilla asked, her gaze fixed on Brian. Brian took a deep breath and began to explain what he had seen, recalling the details with focused intensity. Priscilla listened intently, her expression serious and thoughtful. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Brian asked again, his voice betraying a flicker of fear. Priscilla met his gaze, her voice steady. "Let's just try. It'll just be us." The two children stood there, frozen for a moment, the weight of the moment settling between them as they tried to figure out what to do next. The bathroom seemed smaller now, the air thick with tension. The sound of running water filled the heavy silence as Brian turned on the tap, hoping to mask any noise. "Bend down, Priscilla," Brian whispered, his voice trembling. Priscilla hesitated, her gaze flickering to him nervously. The weight of the moment hung between them, palpable and suffocating. Slowly, she sank to her knees, the cold tiles biting into her skin as the tap continued to run, the only sound breaking the stillness that had settled over them. "Are you sure we should do this?" Priscilla asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile moment. Brian nodded, though uncertain. "It's just like in the videos," he said, his words lacking conviction. Brian leaned, trying to do it the way he had seen the people in his phone did it. Just about putting it inside her, Priscilla screamed, "Stop! It's paining me!" she said, crying, tears gathering in her eyes. "Let's try again." "This time, I will go gently," Brian said, trying again, gently and again, but he still couldn't penetrate. As they left the bathroom, Priscilla's walking step changed immediately after the incident. Her thighs were hurting badly. She moved slowly as she walked back home in pains, with her steps heavy, as though the weight of the day had drained her of all energy. Later that night, she lay on her small bed, her eyes blankly staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. The faint whir of the fan was the only sound in the room, but it felt far away as her thoughts consumed her. Her mind replayed the events of the afternoon over and over, vivid and unrelenting, like a film she couldn't stop watching. The fear and confusion refused to leave her, swirling endlessly in her mind along with Brian's uncertain actions. She felt something she couldn't name, a sense of unease that settled deep within her. It wasn't just the act itself, it was how she felt afterward, as if she had crossed an invisible line that she could never uncross. With a soft sigh, she turned onto her side, gripping her pillow tightly as if it could offer her some comfort. "Why did this happen?" she whispered, her voice shaking with uncertainty. A part of her longed to confide in someone, but who could she turn to? Her mother? She imagined Mrs. Rosaline's face, a mixture of confusion and anger, and instantly knew she couldn't. The clock on the wall ticked on, but Priscilla didn't hear it. Her thoughts were too loud, too overwhelming. She thought of Brian, his face flushed with fear and doubt. He had been her closest friend, someone she trusted without question, but now she wasn't sure what to feel about him, or about their friendship. The following morning, Priscilla distanced herself from Brian. She stayed in her room, pretending to focus on her school books, hiding behind the pages as if they could block out everything else. When her mother called to check on her, she answered with a quick, "I'm fine," though her voice lacked the usual brightness that made it so familiar. Brian, too, carried the heavy burden of guilt. He desperately wanted to check on Priscilla, to ask if she was all right, but every time he considered speaking to her, the memory of what had happened held his words captive, drowning them in shame. The bond that had once seemed unbreakable now felt delicate, strained, and neither of them knew how to mend it. Later that afternoon, as their mothers, Mrs. Janet and Mrs. Rosaline, sat outside, talking about their typical market affairs, Mrs. Janet noticed Priscilla hadn't come out to join them. "Priscilla hasn't been outside to play today," Mrs. Janet remarked, casting a quick glance at Mrs. Rosaline. "Is she feeling all right?" "She said she's fine," Mrs. Rosaline replied, her brow furrowing. "But she's been quieter than usual. Maybe it's just the stress from school." "Even Brian seems off," Mrs. Janet said, her concern rising. "He's been shut in his room all morning. I thought it was just him being lazy." Her comment only made the unspoken tension between Brian and Priscilla feel heavier. From his room, Brian heard their voices, his heart pounding with anxiety. His eyes landed on the phone on the table, the one thing that had set everything in motion. A sharp feeling of resentment surged within him, and for the first time he wished he could erase its existence. Meanwhile, Priscilla sat on her bed, her gaze fixed on the wall, lost in thought. She longed to confide in someone, to tell her mother what was weighing on her, but fear gripped her tightly. What if they discovered what she and Brian had done? The mere thought sent a chill of terror through her. As evening fell, the weight of their unspoken words grew too much for Brian to bear. He took a deep breath and made his way to Priscilla's room. Standing before her door, his hand trembled just above the knob, uncertain. What if she slammed the door in his face? What if she never wanted to see him again? Despite the doubts swirling in his mind, he knew he had no choice but to try. He knocked gently on the door. "Priscilla, it's me. Can we talk?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. Inside, Priscilla froze, her heartbeat quickening. She didn't want to see him, didn't want to relive the confusion and hurt, but a small part of her was desperate to hear him out. After a long pause, she cracked the door open, her gaze fixed on the floor. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Brian shifted nervously, his fingers tugging at the hem of his shirt, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like a heavy stone. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything," Brian murmured, his voice shaky and uncertain. Priscilla's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. "It's not just your fault, Brian," she said softly. "I agreed too, but now I don't know what to do." "Neither do I," Brian admitted, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his guilt. "But I don't want us to stop being friends. You're my best friend, Priscilla. I can't lose you." Weeks passed, and Brian and Priscilla avoided the forbidden content, throwing themselves into the routines of daily life. Yet, beneath their cheerful smiles, a quiet curiosity lingered, whispering in the corners of their minds. One hot afternoon, Brian found refuge under the sprawling branches of a mango tree at school. The shade was a welcome escape, but his thoughts were anything but calm. He sat cross-legged on the dusty ground, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing lines as his mind wrestled with the memories he couldn't seem to shake. As Priscilla approached from a distance, Brian immediately noticed the shift in her demeanor. Her usual bright smile was absent, replaced by a somber expression that seemed to weigh her down. The moment she drew closer, Brian sprang to his feet, concern etched deeply into his features. "Priscilla, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice low but urgent as he took a step toward her. Priscilla paused, her eyes darting around the empty schoolyard, ensuring no one was near enough to overhear. Only then did she finally meet his gaze, her hesitation evident. She finally looked at him, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Brian, I can't stop thinking about it. I think I want to try again. I want to do it again." Brian's eyes widened, a flicker of shock crossing his face. "But we promised," he said, his voice unsteady. "We said we wouldn't after that day." "I know," Priscilla murmured, her tone soft and almost imploring. "But I can't get it out of my head. Just once more, Brian, please." Her eyes held him with an intensity that made his heart pound, and for a moment, Brian felt his resolve begin to crumble under the weight of her plea. He shook his head, trying to resist. What if we get caught? What if something goes wrong? Priscilla's gaze was intense, her voice firm. "It won't happen, just once, and then we'll never do it again, I swear." Brian hesitated, his heart pounding. He knew what they were considering wasn't right, but Priscilla's pleading look and the promise of a final moment made it almost impossible for him to say no. After a long, heavy silence, Brian exhaled deeply. "All right, just once. But I'll decide when," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of reluctance and resignation. Priscilla's face softened with relief, a grateful smile lighting up her features. "Thank you, Brian," she whispered, her voice full of unspoken emotion. Before either could say another word, the school bell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the air. Without a second glance, they both turned and walked back to their separate classrooms, the weight of their unspoken agreement hanging in the air. Brian sat in class, his mind miles away, his eyes glazed as the teacher's voice seemed to dissolve into the background. Thoughts of Priscilla's words lingered in his mind, twisting and turning, making it hard to focus. He absent-mindedly tapped his pencil on the desk, the rhythmic sound offering little comfort as he weighed the risk of their secret. A mixture of excitement and guilt gnawed at him. When the school bell rang, ending the day, it barely registered in his mind, his thoughts still tangled with the decision that loomed ahead. Brian and Priscilla walked home side by side, her hand clutching his with an almost protective strength, as if silently offering comfort. The walk was peaceful, but their minds were far away, lost in the plans they had made. As they reached the compound, the sight of their parents sitting on the veranda brought them back to reality, a reminder of the world they had left outside their secret. The sun blazed in the sky as their mothers chatted and laughed about their market trip, filling the air with easy conversation. Brian and Priscilla exchanged a brief glance, the weight of their secret making their shared moment heavy with unspoken thoughts. Reluctantly, they each retreated to their rooms. Brian lay on his bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, lost in a sea of thoughts as he tried to figure out how to protect their secret. Meanwhile, Priscilla sat at her desk, flipping through her textbook, her mind too distracted to absorb a single word. Later that same evening, as the sun slowly began to set, their mothers continued to chat and laugh outside, their voices echoing through the warm evening air. Priscilla stepped out from her room, her textbook clutched against her chest, and with measured steps, she crossed the compound toward Brian's room. Her footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, as though the weight of her thoughts pressed against her every footstep. Her mother, Mrs. Rosalind, cast a fleeting glance in her direction but thought nothing of it. To her, Priscilla was simply heading to Brian's room to study, as she often did. There was no reason for suspicion, nothing out of the ordinary to disrupt her cheerful conversation outside. Priscilla approached Brian's door with deliberate steps and knocked softly, the sound barely audible over the distant murmur of their parents' chatter. Without waiting long, she eased the door open and slipped inside. Brian was seated cross-legged on the floor, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, his face clouded with tension, as though the weight of the day had finally caught up with him. He glanced up at her, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "Are you sure about this?" Priscilla gave a firm nod, her hands clutching the textbook as if it could steady her resolve. "Let's just make it quick," she murmured, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and determination. Brian hesitated, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Finally, he stood, walked to the door, and turned the lock with a soft click. The sound seemed to linger in the silence, heavy with unspoken tension. As soon as Brian locked the door to the sitting room, Priscilla, who couldn't hold herself any longer, started to remove her gown. She was desperate for Brian's touch, but Brian was hesitant. After a few seconds, Brian removed his shirt, leaving both of them wearing a white singlet. Just then, Priscilla suggested they use the bathroom just as they did the previous time, to avoid being caught by their mothers who were sitting outside. Priscilla stood up from where she was sitting, and they both walked to the bathroom almost immediately in a hurry. As they got to the bathroom, Priscilla questioned, "Do you really think we should do this?" Priscilla's voice was a fragile whisper, her eyes searching Brian's face for reassurance. Brian nodded, but the motion was hesitant and uncertain. It's just like what we saw in the video," he said, his voice barely audible, his word laced with hesitation, as if speaking them out loud might make his fear undeniable. "Let's just make it quick," Priscilla murmured, as she quickly pulled off her clothes, urging Brian to pull his own faster. She was ready to do what they had learned from watching the videos in Brian's phone. She just couldn't wait for him to slide into her. This time, without much effort, Brian was able to penetrate inside Priscilla. He inserted it into her, and she screamed in pleasure. What unfolded next was beyond anything they could have imagined. Watch out for part 2 to uncover the unexpected, shocking twists. If you enjoyed watching and listening to this story, then click on that like button and subscribe to this channel now so that you can see more of my interesting stories and folktales. Click on the video link on your screen now to watch part 2 to this story.